Catherine Reichert is a mother of two, and she has been spending her years intensely grieving the loss of her 16-year-old son Nicky 2 years previously. She says that she never imagined anything bad would happen to her child as she starts recollecting memories she had with Nicky when he was alive. During the time of her grief, Catherine swears to keep Nicky's room as it was, never changing or moving anything. She even forbids her younger son Brady to go into Nicky's room in fear of having Nicky's things disrupted. In her grief, Catherine has isolated herself from her husband and their younger son. Unbeknownst to her, Brady feels alienated and unhappy with the pressure of having to live in his older brother's shadow and his mother's expectations. Her husband Dale is also unhappy, having to spend years dealing with Catherine's grief and neglect of their marriage. Alone in the house after Brady and Dale left for work and school, Catherine keeps herself busy by cleaning the house and picking flowers from her garden. In the afternoon, Catherine calls her husband Dale to remind him of a scheduled dinner they were going to have later tonight. Dale expresses dismay at her decision to keep going to these scheduled dinners, but Catherine ignores his protests. At dinner, Catherine refuses to eat steak, which resulted in an argument with Dale. Dale thinks that she hasn't been eating recently and Catherine protests, saying that she's only trying to cut meat from her diet. At home, Dale carries a drunk Catherine to the bedroom and helps her prepare for bed. She then asks Dale to tell Nicky to prepare to go to the pub tomorrow. Dale ignores her and tells her to rest instead. Later that night, Dale wakes up to a crying Catherine, but he doesn't console and instead goes back to sleep. In a different suburb, Blythe's college professor and failed novelist Walt Braffer, who was the drunk driver involved in the car accident that killed Nicky. He was found not guilty of the accident and suffered no consequences. Despite this, Walt still carries his guilt even years after the accident, which resulted in his drinking. Walter is in class when a young student who also works as a weather reporter named Sherry Banks approaches him to ask for help regarding the course. It is obvious that Sherry is harboring feelings for Walt, which Walt quietly reciprocates. In another scene, Nicky's childhood friend Girdy is shown sitting in a basketball court. He was the one driving with Nicky when the accident happened. Girdy's guilt manifests in him getting into trouble all the time, which includes getting into gang fights and stealing. Girdy is currently in a youth detention center serving a punishment for car theft. After a few days, his punishment ends and he is finally allowed to go home. Outside, Girdy sees his dad Carl waiting for him and they immediately have a disagreement. Carl still hasn't forgiven Girdy for what happened, which resulted in a dysfunctional relationship between father and son. This also affects his relationship with second wife Elise, Girdy's stepmother. At their lake house, Girdy, his father Carl and his stepmother Elise are having breakfast. Carl gives Girdy a week to find a job or else he will throw Girdy out of the house. Carl leaves for work, leaving Elise and Girdy in the house. Girdy has always had an uneasy relationship with Elise, whom he treats with open and aggressive hostility because he thinks that she is only staying with his father for money. Elise strikes up a conversation with Girdy, but he leaves instead of answering her. Meanwhile, Walt finds a newspaper cutting of the accident in his bookshelf. The next day, he visits his autistic younger brother Dennis, who was also in the accident with him. Dennis has not been able to leave his house for 2 years after the accident, which also resulted in his worsening mental health issues. Seeing Dennis' condition, Walt meets with Carl, Girdy's dad, who also happens to be Dennis' psychiatrist, and asks him what can be done to help Dennis recover from his condition. When Walt starts talking about the accident, Carl puts 2 and 2 together and realizes that Carl was the drunk driver in the same accident that Nicky and his son Girdy were in 2 years prior. On the other hand, Catherine unwillingly gets up from bed to drive Brady to school after her husband Dale calls her out for not doing anything in the house since Nicky's death. After driving Brady to school, Catherine stops by the place of the accident where a cross is perched beside a tree. Catherine lays a blanket next to it and eats a snack as she watches cars passing by. When she arrives home, she goes to Nicky's room and starts crying after looking at his things. She does this whenever she starts missing Nicky. Back to Girdy. He arrives at a pizza shop for a job interview, but because he had already been jailed and had committed crimes in the past, the manager refused to hire him. Girdy perseveres, and after talking for a while, he is able to convince the manager to give him a job. Back home, Girdy is in his room when his stepmother Elise walks in uninvited, disrupting his privacy. Girdy gets angry and tells her to leave. Angry about what happened, Girdy leaves the house and walks to a nearby park. He finds a bench and starts reading a book. There he sees his high school friend Melissa. She tells him that she had seen Nicky's mom Catherine a while back and that Girdy should reconnect with her. After refusing Melissa's offer to accompany him to meet up with Catherine, he declines and leaves. Meanwhile, at home, Walt is watching the television, showing his student Sherry reporting on the weather. His wife Abby is also in the bedroom with him, but when she tries to get close to him, he turns away and ignores her. Fed up with Walt's behavior, Abby decides to leave him and live with her sister. He tries to stop her, but Abby refuses to stay, telling him that she had been unhappy for a while now and that their marriage isn't working out anymore. The very next day, Walt runs into Sherry at school and they both begin a sexual relationship. That same day at Girdy's house, he walks past his father's bedroom and sees a naked Elise brushing hair. When she sees him, she immediately covers herself with a towel and asks him what he's doing in their room. Without answering, Girdy slowly approaches Elise and they both end up in bed. Not long after, they hear the sound of Carl's car pulling up on the driveway and Girdy immediately hides in the bathroom. Carl walks inside the bedroom and Elise distracts him as Jiri quietly sneaks out of the room. Jody and Elise develop an affair and would spend time together whenever Carl was away for work. A few days later, Jiri is working at a pizza shop when his high school friend Melissa walks in. She asks him why he didn't go to the party that she invited him to, and Jiri makes an excuse saying that he had a lot of work that day. After the manager scolds Jiri for talking to a customer, Melissa leaves and says that she'll wait for Jiri after his shift. Later that night, Melissa drives Jiri home, and since it's getting late, Jiri invites her inside. Once inside the house, Melissa and Jiri talk about Nikki, making Jiri emotional. As they are about to kiss, Elise walks into the kitchen and sees them together. She asks Jiri who the girl was, and Melissa introduces herself as Jiri's high school friend. Elise leaves without introducing herself to Melissa. Sensing the tension, Jiri asks Melissa to leave as well. At Dennis' house, Walt finds out that Dennis has been talking to a girl named Sylvie on the phone. When Dennis was asleep, Walt secretly calls Sylvie and asks her to visit Dennis' apartment. When Sylvie arrives, Dennis tries to hide as he hasn't seen anyone except Walt for 2 years. Sylvie already knows everything about Dennis' condition and decides to leave the room to give him privacy. She tells Dennis that she will stand on the other side of the door so they can pretend that they are talking on the phone, to which Dennis agrees. They start talking and Walt watches his brother act normal again after the accident. Walt is relieved to see that there's still hope for Dennis' condition to improve. Later that day, Sherry and Walt are in bed, talking. Sherry tells him that she interviewed him 2 years ago when he was involved in a car accident. Hearing this, Walt is dismayed and leaves Sherry without saying anything. That same day at the pizza place, Jiri is seen working as usual when his manager walks in and asks Jiri to work faster. Fed up with his manager's treatment, Jiri finally talks back and they end up arguing, resulting in Jiri quitting his job. He calls his friend Melissa to drive him home and she agrees, seeing Jiri spending more time with Melissa than with her. Elise gets jealous and confronts Jiri about it. He ignores her and leaves with Melissa. That night, Jiri couldn't sleep and decided to call Catherine. They arranged to meet the next day. Jiri and Catherine meet at a nearby beach and start talking about Nikki. We understand now from their conversation that the car that Jiri and Nikki were driving that got them into an accident was stolen, which resulted in Jiri spending time in jail. After talking for some time, their respective confessions bring both of them out of their respective guilts, and the burden that has been in their hearts for so long is slowly lifted. When Catherine arrives home, she gathers all of Nikki's belongings and burns them. She now realizes that she cannot change the past and therefore cannot change her since death. After 2 long years of mourning, Catherine finally decides to move on. Not long after, Catherine finds her younger son Brady and apologizes to him for neglecting him the past 2 years. She tells him that she plans to go on a vacation with him to make up for lost time. Brady accepts his mother's apology and they embrace. At Dennis' house, Walt watches him as he prepares for a date with Sylvie. After 2 years, Dennis finally decides to step out of the house. Realizing that things are finally looking up for his younger brother, Walt finally gathers the courage to meet Catherine. He decides to go to Catherine's house to apologize, but Catherine is still hurt. She tries to fight him, still not ready to accept Walt's apology. She then steps inside the car crying and leaves with Brady. When Jordy gets home, he tries to talk to Elise but is stopped by his father Carl, who immediately starts punching and beating him. Carl had just found out about his and Elise's affair. Jordy and Carl end up in a physical fight which resulted in Carl getting badly injured, and Elise immediately rushes to take him to the hospital. At the end, Dennis is seen having dinner with Sylvie at a restaurant and Catherine is seen driving, smiling and happy after so many years of living in grief. Jordy leaves town with Melissa for a fresh start and Walt sits in a restaurant alone. What a depressing movie. I think this will only heighten my seasonal depression. All the characters were in mourning and hurting each other. They all deserved better, but some of them were vile. What did you guys think? Let us know in the comments.